Dear viewers, what would you do if a death row inmate about to be executed begs you to believe he's innocent and asks you to risk everything to prove it? Today's story is about a female prison guard in Texas whose entire world is turned upside down when she receives an impossible request from behind prison bars. This isn't just a story about breaking rules or crossing professional boundaries. It's a story about a choice between loyalty to the system or loyalty to your own conscience. This journey will challenge every belief she ever had about justice, truth, and what it means to do the right thing in a flawed world. Before we dive into that extraordinary journey, I want you to brace yourself, because what you're about to hear will make you see justice and human courage in a whole new light. If stories like this move you, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Trust me, you'll want to stick around until the end, because this story has twists that no one could see coming. Let's begin with Elena Vasquez, a 34-year-old female prison guard at the Huntsville unit in Texas. For nearly 10 years on the job, she has followed every rule, every procedure, every protocol with absolute seriousness. Elena isn't the type to be swayed by emotions or take shortcuts for herself. She's different. Her colleagues respect her for her fairness and discipline. Whether it's guards, inmates, or kitchen staff, she treats everyone with the same calm respect. There's something in her steady demeanor and warm, low voice that makes people naturally listen whenever she speaks. Elena dreamed of becoming a nurse since she was a little girl. Growing up in the border town of Laredo, she watched her father, a veteran, serve in the local ambulance service. He taught her that working in rescue or the military isn't just a job. It's a promise to protect life in every circumstance, and most importantly, never to abandon those who need help. After graduating from a military nursing program, Elena joined the National Guard and served in Iraq. She cared for wounded soldiers amid bombs and gunfire, stitched wounds in harsh conditions, and watched comrades fall. When the war ended, Elena returned with deep psychological scars, explosions, the smell of smoke, the faces she couldn't save. They haunted her in every sleep. Working in civilian hospitals brought those memories back, so she left the medical field. When she learned the Texas Department of Criminal Justice was hiring, she applied. For Elena, prison was a place where order was maintained by clear rules, where emotions had to be locked away. She believed that within those cold walls, she could control herself and the world around her. At Huntsville, Elena quickly became known for her integrity. She had never been disciplined, never shown favoritism, and never insulted anyone. To her colleagues, she was a symbol of toughness, and they called her the Steel Woman of Huntsville. Even so, when night fell over the long, echoing corridors, she sometimes wondered if she was maintaining order or just imprisoning souls, including her own. One early summer evening, as her shift was nearing its end, a guard announced that an inmate wanted to see her privately. It was Ethan Morales, 39 years old, a death row inmate who had been locked up for 8 years, with just 3 days until his execution. Elena was about to refuse. Last-minute requests were usually just the hopeless wishes of the dying, but the guard added that he was insistent, and this isn't for himself. Curiosity crept into Elena's mind. She walked down the death row corridor, where fluorescent lights cast long shadows on the concrete floor. At the end of the row, Ethan Morales sat waiting, with an oddly calm demeanor, no anger, no fear, just deep, weary eyes. To Elena, he was just another inmate on the checklist, but she didn't know that this seemingly routine meeting that night would pull her into a dangerous journey, one that would force her to confront the limits of her profession, her conscience, and the lifelong faith in justice she had always held. Ethan Morales, 39 years old, Mexican-American born and raised in Dallas, didn't match the image Elena usually had of a death row inmate. His file stated clearly, formerly a mechanical engineer working for a major Texas-based energy company. Before his arrest, he had a wife and a young son, a small house in the suburbs, an ordinary life like any other working American. But it all collapsed one April night 8 years ago, when the company director he worked for was murdered right in the parking lot after hours. Police found the victim's car broken into, and a blood-stained tool in the trunk of Ethan's car. No eyewitnesses, no clear surveillance footage, just a chain of circumstantial evidence and vague testimony from a coworker saying he had argued with the director about being fired. That was enough to charge him. Ethan didn't resist and couldn't afford a good lawyer. His wife, in desperation, left Texas with their son and never came back. The death sentence was handed down quickly, and his name disappeared from the newspapers after just a few weeks of headlines. As Elena read those lines in the file, she felt something didn't add up. Murderers usually had shifty or angry eyes, but Ethan had an unusually quiet demeanor. From her first day at Huntsville Unit, he had always been the most reassuring inmate for the guards. He never caused trouble, never got into fights, never complained, never begged for clemency. He taught other inmates to read, helped maintenance staff fix small equipment in the workshop, always followed schedules and rules. Model inmate, that's how everyone described him in monthly reports. Elena had thought maybe he had accepted his fate, like many others on death row, but something in his eyes made her not fully believe that theory. He didn't have the desperation of someone who had given up. He seemed like someone waiting for something, not a miracle but a chance to be heard. During long shifts, Elena passed Ethan's cell many times. He always stood up, politely greeted her with a calm gaze. No fear in those eyes, no resentment, just weariness and something like quiet faith. In a place where most people were worn down by loneliness and regret, that attitude intrigued her. One afternoon, while checking the medical list, she overheard a young guard say that Morales had once saved another inmate from an asthma attack in the workshop. By the time the nurse arrived, he had administered first aid and gotten the man through the crisis. He was an engineer, but he knows first aid like a doctor, the guard said. Elena just nodded, but inside a conflicting feeling stirred. The man whose file said remorseless killer acted like a teacher and a rescuer. She told herself not to let emotions interfere with work, that the legal file was the truth. But at night when she saw the faint light from Ethan's cell, she still wondered what he was thinking in there. People about to die usually showed all kinds of emotions, anger, despair, or begging. But Morales just quietly read books, jotted notes in a small notebook, and occasionally smiled when the chapel bell echoed through the thick walls. Elena knew there was something unusual about him, and that's what kept her from shaking off the curiosity mixed with unease. This man wasn't like any inmate she'd met. He didn't beg for mercy, didn't harbor grudges, just steadfastly repeated that he was innocent, that someday the truth would be heard. In an environment where most people lied for the last scraps of advantage, Ethan Morales's calm made Elena feel there was something trustworthy about him. And that very composure, in a place where death was always near, planted the first seed of doubt in her. The doubt that maybe this time, the man sentenced to death wasn't guilty. 3 days before execution, Ethan Morales sent an official request to the warden's office to speak privately with guard Elena Vasquez. When Elena received the notice, she was momentarily surprised. For 8 years, he had never demanded anything beyond the basics, like books and writing paper. At first she thought he might want to say goodbye or ask for a prayer before death. But as she entered the death row area, his eyes told her this wasn't an ordinary meeting. Ethan stood when she appeared, his voice calm and polite to an unbelievable degree for a man facing execution. He didn't ask for a reduced sentence, didn't complain, didn't beg. Instead, he simply asked her to do one thing: read a letter he had written. Elena hesitated, because regulations prohibited prison staff from receiving any personal documents from inmates. But he said firmly that the letter contained nothing dangerous, just the last story of his life, one that needed someone in the outside world to know. The calm in his voice made her accept, even though she felt a sense inside that she had just crossed a thin line between discipline and compassion. When she opened the letter, the handwriting appeared neat and clear, not trembling like other death row letters. In it, Ethan recounted in detail the night the company director was killed, a report the court file never mentioned. He spoke of a coworker named Raymond Cole, the maintenance department head, whom he believed was the real perpetrator. Raymond had been warned by the company for embezzlement, and the director had threatened to fire him. On the night of the murder, Raymond left the company 10 minutes before Ethan, but evidence from the scene disappeared from the investigation file. Ethan wrote that he had seen Raymond's car parked near the lot, but when he testified to that in court, the prosecutor dismissed it as coincidence. He had no private lawyer to counter, and the company quickly paid all funeral costs, closing the case like a sealed accident. At the end of the letter, Ethan wrote a line that made Elena choke up. "I know no one believes a death row inmate. I don't need forgiveness, just for someone, even one person, to understand that I didn't kill him. If you read these lines, at least the truth has escaped these walls once." Elena folded the letter, her heart in turmoil. She looked at Ethan, standing still, hands lightly on the bars. His eyes held no pleading, just a strange serenity, as if whether she believed or not no longer mattered. What mattered was that finally someone had heard him. "Why me?" she asked, her voice low but firm. Ethan replied, "Because she was the only one in the prison who looked at him without contempt." The words stunned Elena. For years, she had kept distance from inmates, seeing emotional separation as the only way to survive the job. But now, that distance seemed to be closing. She realized she was listening to him, not as a guard, but as one human facing another. As she left the cell, the letter still in her hand, heavy like evidence of something unsaid, she walked down the cold corridor, her shoes echoing steadily, but in her mind, his written words rang out. The overlooked details, the vague testimonies, and his calm voice, all like an unrelenting haunting melody. That night, back at her dorm, she couldn't sleep. Hot wind blew through the window, carrying the smell of rust and dampness, and Elena sat motionless, the letter spread on the table. She read it over and over, line by line, then took notes on another paper, just to see if the details matched the file. But the more she read, the more everything fit together terrifyingly. It wasn't the desperate lies of a dying man, but the statement of someone who had accepted his fate but refused to let the truth die with him. The next morning, during roll call, Elena still couldn't shake the image of those eyes. Calm, truthful, with nothing left to lose, but still holding dignity. For the first time in years, she couldn't see an inmate as just a number on the list. Ethan Morales, the man doomed to die, had planted in her heart a question that wasn't easy to answer. What if he really was innocent? The next day, Elena couldn't focus on work. Every sound in the death row block, the clinking of iron locks, shoes echoing on concrete, creaking doors, faded into the distance, as if she were somewhere else. In her mind, only the lines from Ethan's letter remained, and his calm eyes as he said he just needed one person out here to know the truth. After her shift, instead of going back to her room, she went to the inmate records office. She knew this was beyond her authority, but the reason and instincts of a former nurse, who had seen so many lives abandoned, urged her to verify. She lied to the archivist that the warden requested a file review for an internal audit. The thick file, yellowed paper bound with old twine. Elena opened it, eyes scanning the faded typed lines. The scene report stated no direct eyewitness saw Ethan commit the crime, only a fingerprint possibly matching his on the tool, found near the scene. The DNA report said, sample did not meet clear standards, but was still submitted as evidence. She frowned, noting those details. When she flipped to the witness testimonies, she saw the co-worker's name, Raymond Cole, the one Ethan mentioned in the letter. The file said, Cole had left the company and could not be contacted after trial. No address, no additional testimony. Elena felt a chill run down her spine. How could a key witness just vanish right after the case closed without anyone caring? She continued to the court verdict. No mitigating circumstances. Defendant showed no remorse. The last line made her pause. She recalled Ethan's voice, his eyes as he spoke of that night. No anger or begging, just the pain and weariness of someone misunderstood for too long. For the first time in her life, Elena felt the foundation of faith she had relied on to survive nearly 10 years as a guard beginning to crack. She had always believed the law was the barrier between order and chaos, believed in the principle that every criminal must pay. But what if the system was wrong? If the barrier she guarded every day was built on flawed evidence and lies? That question choked her. That afternoon, during her shift, Elena went to the small chapel at the end of the corridor, where Chaplain Brooks, the silver-haired, deep-voiced chaplain, was rearranging chairs. He had served at Huntsville for over 20 years, witnessing hundreds go through the injection room. Elena rarely spoke privately with him, but today she entered hesitantly. "Have you ever talked to Morales?" she asked. Brooks looked up, gazing at her calmly. "He's one of the rare ones who doesn't pray for himself," he replied. "He always prays for the soul of the dead man, and for his family." Elena fell silent. "Do you believe he's innocent?" Brooks smiled faintly, not answering directly. "I wasn't there when it happened, but I know this: a liar doesn't pray for the man he killed." He spoke and turned back to the chairs, leaving Elena standing silent in the quiet room, light from the window falling on her conflicted face. That night, Elena returned to her dorm late. She reopened the file and compared it to Ethan's letter. Every detail he mentioned, the departure time from the company, the missing coworker, the firing argument, all matched. She searched old news online and found that yes, the company had faced financial fraud suspicions right after the case, but the investigation was suspended without specific reason. The pieces began fitting together, forming an undeniable picture. Elena bit her lip, gripping her notepaper tightly. She knew if she reported these findings, she'd be reprimanded for unauthorized file access. But if she stayed silent, she'd become part of the wrong she was starting to hate. On the table, the clock struck midnight. She looked up at the small mirror, seeing her face reflected in the dim yellow light. Tired, tense, but with something new: determination. For the first time in years, she was no longer sure about the line between right and wrong. Maybe the justice she had believed in wasn't as absolute as she thought. And as the first rays of Texas morning light crept through the window, Elena knew she was no longer the same. In silence, she folded the file, tucked it into her jacket pocket, and walked out of the room with one thought: if the system could wrongly convict one man, that man couldn't die just because everyone had stopped listening. The next morning, Elena went to Warden Mitchell's office, a man she had always respected for his calm and fairness. She brought Ethan's file, intending to speak frankly. Mitchell was standing by the window, looking out at the inmate exercise yard, with the weary look of someone who had done this job too long. When Elena knocked, he looked up and nodded her in. She placed the file on the desk, trying to keep her voice steady. "Sir, I think some points in inmate Morales's case need to be reviewed." Mitchell looked at her, sharp eyes behind silver-framed glasses. "Reviewed? He's set for execution in 3 days, Vasquez. This isn't our job." Elena persisted. "I know, sir, but the DNA evidence in the file is blurry. The witness disappeared, and there are signs of suppressed documents. I just think someone should report it to the department for re-examination." Mitchell was silent for a few seconds, then sighed. "Elena, you're good, but you have to understand boundaries. Our job isn't to second-guess the system. If you start doubting execution procedures, you won't last long here." He spoke gently, but the reminder held absolute firmness. Don't let emotions make you cross lines. Once sentenced to death, all appeals are over. He closed the file and handed it back. "Do your job well, and leave the rest to the law." Elena fell silent, saluted, and walked out, heart pounding. The iron door closed behind her, the clank sounding like a final period. But in her mind, another voice rang out. If the system is wrong and no one does anything, what meaning does this law even have? That afternoon, as inmates were returned to cells, Elena went back to the records room. She waited until the on-duty staff left, then opened Ethan's file drawer again. Inside, she found note papers with document numbers removed from the original file, small print in red ink, transferred to confidential file, Dallas Justice Department. She carefully noted those numbers on a small paper, hiding it in her pocket. At this point, she knew she was breaking rules. She could be suspended, even prosecuted, for accessing confidential files. But instinct drove her. If she didn't do it, no one would. That evening, Elena returned to her dorm late. She sat at her personal computer, opened an anonymous email address she had used in the military for internal reports. She searched for Lucia Reyes, a Houston Chronicle reporter who had investigated several famous wrongful convictions in Texas. She wrote briefly, "There's a man about to be executed at Huntsville. Name Ethan Morales. Evidence suppressed in the file. I have document numbers." Under the signature, she wrote only a corrections officer who wants to tell the truth. When the cursor hovered over send, her hand trembled. For 8 years on the job, she had learned to follow orders, ask no questions, keep emotions out. Every decision had to follow procedure, every action approved. Now, she was about to break it all. She took a deep breath and clicked send. The screen said, "Message sent." A small line, but it made her heart race to the point of breathlessness. Then Elena shut down the computer, sat silent in the dark room, hearing only the steady whir of the ceiling fan and the dry hot wind outside the window. She knew, from that moment, there was no turning back. 2 days later, Lucia Reyes replied. The email was short but clear. "I received the info. If you have more details, send via this secure channel. I'll check." She attached a link to an anonymous platform where insiders often sent data. Elena read the message over and over, hand still trembling slightly. She hadn't expected the reporter to respond so quickly. During lunch break, she sneaked into the staff computer room, logged into the internal system to find more documents. Each click made her heart jump. She downloaded a few records of meetings between the prosecutor and investigators, files marked not public. In them, she saw Raymond Cole's name mentioned, then crossed out. There was even a note, "Witness withdrew testimony, no need to present in court." She printed those lines, put them in a small envelope, and sent via the secure channel to Lucia. As she left the room, she looked around. No one saw. But Elena knew the system logged every access. If anyone checked the data log, they'd know she opened the files. On the way back to the dorm, night wind blew through the barbed wire fences, carrying a faint metallic whistle. Elena stopped, looking at the lit watchtowers. In that moment, she felt she had just crossed the invisible line between lawkeeper and lawbreaker. But strangely, she wasn't afraid. There was only a strange feeling, relief, as if finally she was doing the most right thing since stepping into this place. For 8 years, Elena Vasquez had lived within the framework of procedures and orders. Tonight, for the first time, she chose to be her true self. 3 days after sending the documents, Elena received an anonymous call on the prison's internal line. The voice on the other end was low, quick, but decisive. "This is Lucia Reyes, Houston Chronicle reporter. I need to meet you. No more email. Coffee shop off Highway 75, 10 miles from Huntsville tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. Elena stood silent for a few seconds, looking around the empty corridor, heart pounding. She didn't know why she agreed, only that the truth was within reach, and she couldn't turn away. The next morning, she drove out of the prison grounds in her rare civilian clothes. The small roadside coffee shop, run down. Brown wooden walls, smell of roasted coffee mixed with motor oil from the adjacent gas station. Lucia Reyes was already seated in the corner, slim, hair tied back, young face but sharp eyes. When Elena entered, Lucia just nodded slightly, saying nothing until the server left. "I've read everything you sent," Lucia began, voice low but firm, "and I've found what the Justice Department file deliberately omitted." She pulled a printed stack from her bag, placing it lightly on the table. The company director where Morales worked, Patrick Nolan, was preparing an internal whistleblower report on embezzling millions from the Worker Safety Fund. A closed executive meeting was scheduled the week he was killed. 1 day before filing the report, he died. Elena looked at Lucia, a chill running down her spine. "Are you sure? I have copies of internal emails and money transfer records." Lucia replied quickly, with the experienced tone of someone who had exposed lies before. "I also found in the police file fingerprints at the scene not matching Morales, but matching a former company security guard named Raymond Cole. This man quit a month before the crime and vanished after." That name hit Elena like an electric shock. Raymond Cole, the one Ethan mentioned in the first letter, the one the file said, could not be contacted. She leaned back in her chair, hands gripping the coffee cup tightly. So, He could have been framed. Lucia nodded, eyes serious. Not just could have. All signs show Morales was chosen as the fall guy, low-level engineer, Mexican-American, easy to manipulate, and the company needed a name to close the case fast. A perfect story for the media and court. Elena fell silent, her stomach knotting. For years, she had believed in the process, in the system's fairness, but now, sitting in the roadside coffee shop, between a young reporter and a stack of documents full of evidence, she realized everything she had ever believed might just be a wall built to hide the truth. Lucia continued, her voice quick and full of details, as if placing the final piece in a puzzle. After the case, the company was taken over by a new group. One of the executives who had opposed Director Nolan is now the current CEO. I called his old office. The secretary said, he's in Mexico on extended leave. Lucia paused, looking straight at Elena. If what we have is true, then Morales wasn't just wrongfully convicted. He's a victim of a large-scale cover-up conspiracy. Elena took a deep breath, her heart in turmoil. She knew Lucia wasn't exaggerating. The evidence, the missing testimonies, the overlooked fingerprints, all matched what she had seen in the file. What are you going to do with this information? She asked. Lucia was silent for a few seconds, then spoke slowly. I'll verify everything, but I need you to help me get more internal evidence. Any documents, notes or copies of minutes from inside the prison that can prove Morales never confessed to the crime. Elena looked out the window, where the highway stretched endlessly under the sun. She understood that if she continued, there would be no way back. She wouldn't just lose her job, she could be prosecuted for leaking confidential documents. But thinking of Ethan's eyes, the way he spoke of the truth as the only sacred thing left, she knew she couldn't stop. I'll find it, she said softly, her voice more certain than ever. Lucia smiled faintly, the first time since they met. I knew you would. You're not the heartless person they think you are. The two left the shop near noon. On the drive back to Huntsville, Elena drove through the scorched fields, her mind like rolling waves. She remembered what Warden Mitchell had said the day before. If you doubt the procedures, you won't survive in this profession. Maybe he was right. But she also understood that there are moments when living true to your conscience matters more than living by the rules. That evening, Elena reopened Morales's personal file again, this time with different eyes. Every line, every number, every blank in the minutes told the same story, a story someone had tried to erase. When she folded the file shut, the fluorescent light cast her long shadow on the floor. Outside, it was completely dark. Somewhere in the prison, Ethan Morales still sat in his small cell, perhaps thinking the world had forgotten him. But Elena knew, now she was certain, he was innocent. He was just a name chosen, an ordinary man pushed into the abyss so others could stand high. And if no one else would do anything, she would be the first to break that wall of silence. The days that followed passed in tension and vigilance. Elena and Lucia communicated through encrypted emails and short calls, just a few words then immediately deleted. Every night after her shift, Elena drove out the prison gate, stopping at an empty parking lot 15 minutes from Huntsville, where the phone signal was strong enough to send messages. They coordinated to gather every piece of document, every buried trace over 8 years. Lucia worked non-stop in Houston, while Elena, being inside the system, became the most crucial link. One evening, Lucia sent a brief message. I found someone willing to talk. His name is Harold Green, former chief accountant of the company, terminal cancer. Elena read the message, feeling both hope and fear. Lucia scheduled to meet him the next day at Memorial Hermann Hospital in Houston. The interview lasted over 2 hours. In the recording Lucia sent Elena to listen to, Harold's voice was hoarse, trembling but decisive. He said that in March of the year of the case, Director Nolan had discovered internal accounts drained of hundreds of thousands of dollars. When he prepared to report to the Occupational Safety Committee, some senior leaders panicked. One of them, whom Harold called Mr. K, had hired people to clean up all evidence. Morales was just the most convenient name, Harold said in the recording. Young, mild-mannered minority, no strong lawyer. When the police came, the company handed over everything, even the tool he had used in the workshop. They told me, let the court handle the rest. After sending the recording, Lucia messaged, this is what we need, but we must have official evidence in the police file, or at least in the prison, to prove Morales never confessed. Can you help me? Elena sat in the small office, pale yellow light shining down on the file she had just opened. She knew what Lucia meant, accessing the prison's confidential archives, where only the warden and records chief had access. Every time she swiped her card, the system logged the time and username. If anyone discovered it, she'd be fired immediately. But thinking of Ethan, still steadfast in his fragile belief that someone out there was listening, she knew she had no choice. Late one night after the shift ended and the corridors were silent, Elena returned to the administrative office. She wore gloves, used her staff card to open the steel door of the archives. Inside, it was cold and dark, hundreds of file boxes stacked full by year, by inmate number. She went to the section marked 20015-20200, where Ethan Morales's file was kept. Elena opened it, heart pounding, sweat beading on her forehead. On the last page, she found the interview minutes between Ethan and the prison inspector after sentencing. The final line stated clearly, inmate maintains innocence, refuses to sign oral confession acknowledgement. She took a deep breath. This was the final piece proving Ethan never confessed, that the entire conviction process was set up to close the file. She pulled out her phone, quickly photographed every page, then returned the file to its exact place, careful to the last detail. As she stepped out, she didn't know a shadow was watching from afar. The next morning, during the briefing meeting, Warden Mitchell called her to stay after everyone else left. He sat behind the desk, hands clasped, eyes heavy. Tasquez, I heard you stayed in the office after shift yesterday. What's going on? His voice wasn't harsh, but cold. Elena tried to stay calm, saying she was just reviewing personnel files for the security audit. Mitchell stared at her so long, she had to take a deep breath to meet his gaze. You do good work, but I see you're taking too much interest in inmate Morales. I told you, let the system do its job. Don't let pity make you make mistakes. Elena nodded, trying to keep calm. As she walked out, she knew Mitchell had started suspecting. That afternoon, Lucia called back, her voice excited but hoarse from fatigue. I checked the fingerprints with a source in Houston police. It matches Raymond Cole perfectly. He was arrested for assault, but released right after Nolan's murder. I have the confirmation record. Elena listened, heart racing. Is that enough to reopen the case? She asked. Not yet, Lucia replied. We need to verify the court never knew this information. If someone in the system deliberately hid it, this will be a serious cover-up. Elena fell silent, feeling her whole body heavy. In her mind, the image of Ethan sitting in his cell, dim light on his face. She knew she held the only chance to save a man from death, but it was also a double-edged sword that could end her career. That night, on her shift, she saw Warden Mitchell walking the death row corridor. He glanced at her, eyes full of meaning. Unease spread through her. She understood, if she wanted to act, she had to act now before everything was sealed again. While Mitchell stopped to check the duty log, Elena quickly turned into the old control room, where the inmate file backup server was kept. She plugged the USB into the computer port, copying all the photos from the night before, along with access data. The screen showed transfer complete. She unplugged the USB, hid it in her pocket, and left before Mitchell returned. As she passed through the steel door to the yard, Elena clearly smelled the cold iron in the air. She knew, from this moment, everything would change, for her, for Ethan, and for the system she had once absolutely trusted. But this time, she wasn't trembling in fear. For the first time in 8 years, Elena Vasquez felt truly alive, even in the shadow of an act that could destroy everything. Only 48 hours before the sentence was carried out, the atmosphere in the prison grew heavier than ever. Everyone knew what was coming, though no one dared say it. Elena walked the death row corridor, feeling every eye on her. She clearly sensed the scrutinizing looks from a few colleagues, especially Warden Mitchell, who seemed to be silently watching her since their talk the day before. The internal control system had started reviewing access logs, and Elena knew sooner or later someone would discover she had entered the archives unauthorized. In her jacket pocket, the small USB containing all the data, recording copy, minutes, photos, and fingerprint evidence, now felt like a ticking time bomb. She couldn't keep it on her long, but couldn't go public yet. That noon, Lucia sent a message. I submitted the story to the editors, but they require independent verification from a lawyer or investigative agency. No one will publish without a stay of execution order. Elena read it, feeling her heart squeezed tight. Time was running out, and the system's every procedure was designed to block the truth, not find it. She knew if she waited for the press, Ethan would die before the story hit the front page. That evening, as inmates were returned to cells, Elena stood before Ethan's cell. He was sitting writing something on a scrap of paper, dim light falling on his calm face. Hearing her approach, he looked up, giving a faint smile. "You're here," he said, voice hoarse but strangely peaceful. Elena didn't beat around the bush. "Ethan, I need you to listen. There are things in the file that aren't right. Someone tried to hide evidence. I'm trying to fix it, but I don't know if it'll be in time." He was silent for a few seconds, then set down the pen. "You don't have to do this," he replied softly, as if comforting her more than himself. "I've lived 8 years in this darkness. If the truth is seen even after I'm gone, that's enough." "No," Elena interrupted, voice choking. "I won't let you die for a crime you didn't commit." Ethan looked at her long, eyes no longer fearful, just strangely trusting. "I believe in you," he said softly. 3 simple words that made Elena not know whether to cry or fear. She nodded, tried to stay calm, and left the corridor, feeling like someone was watching every step. That night, back at her dorm, yard lights reflected through the window in long, blurry streaks. She knew she had only one choice: act before it was too late. She opened her computer, wrote a 1-day leave request for sudden illness, sent it directly to HR and copied to Mitchell. Then she turned off her personal phone, deleted all messages between her and Lucia. Every action calculated like a military mission. In her mind, she mapped the plan. Tomorrow morning, she'd drive to Houston, meet Lucia and the human rights lawyer she had just contacted, hand over the USB with the data in person. Only evidence from inside the system could force the authorities to stay the execution. She'd have to leave the prison early morning, before Mitchell checked the request. Once out the gate, she knew she couldn't return. Outside the window, Texas insects chirped steadily, hot wind gusting through the thin curtain. Elena sat motionless on the bed, looking at the staff ID in her hand, the card that was once her pride, now a burden. She thought of her father, who had said doing right isn't always safe, but doing wrong never lets you rest easy. For the first time, she understood that deeply. She wasn't a hero, just a woman who couldn't bear watching a life crushed by the cold machinery of justice. Before turning off the light, she wrote a few short lines on paper by the bed. "If I'm investigated, contact Lucia Reyes, Houston Chronicle. She has everything." Tomorrow morning, she'd leave. Tonight she sat in silence, hearing the clock tick each beat, like a countdown to judgment. Every minute brought fear that the system would tighten the noose before she could act. But amid the fear, there was a small spark, fragile hope that this time, the truth wouldn't be buried. And in that darkness, Elena Vasquez understood there were only 2 days left to save a man, and perhaps the last 2 days to save her own soul. The next morning, before the sun could shine through Huntsville's barbed wire fences, Elena had left the prison. She drove nearly 2 hours straight on I-45 toward Houston, wind whipping through the window, dust trailing long streaks behind. On the seat beside her was the small USB, the only thing that could save a man's life. When she met Lucia in the parking lot behind the Houston Chronicle office, the two just nodded instead of speaking. Elena handed Lucia the USB, with no message except, "If anyone has to take responsibility, it's me." Lucia understood, clutched the small drive to her chest, nodded, and disappeared into the building. Elena returned to Huntsville that same day, heart heavy but lighter than ever, because at least she had done everything she could. That afternoon, while logging duty, the TV in the control room suddenly blared loud. A guard shouted, "My God, it's Morales's case." Elena looked up. On the screen, the Houston Chronicle logo appeared clearly. The anchor's voice rushed. An insider source has just revealed evidence that Ethan Morales, death row inmate at Huntsville unit, may have been wrongfully convicted. According to leaked documents, fingerprints at the scene do not match Morales, but match former security employee Raymond Cole. Additionally, a recording released this morning shows leaders of the victim's former company involved in corruption and directed the cover-up of the case. The whole room held its breath. A few staff turned to look at Elena, but she kept calm. Outside, the news spread like wildfire. Within hours, all of Texas was buzzing. Major outlets, Dallas Morning News, KTRK Houston, Fox 26, all ran the story simultaneously, calling it an earthquake in the Texas justice system. Famous human rights lawyer David Kaplan quickly filed an emergency petition for the state court to review the case and stay the execution. On social media, #Justice for Morales shot to the top of trends. People gathered at Huntsville unit gates with signs, "Don't kill the innocent, review the case." The crowd grew hourly, packed against the fences, facing riot police sent to maintain order. Live TV captured dozens of cameras pointed straight at the gray prison building, where Ethan Morales still sat in isolation. Elena watched the scene through the office window, heart pounding. Part of her wanted to smile, because the truth was finally out, but another part tightened with fear. She knew what had happened wasn't a miracle, but the most serious data leak in Huntsville prison history, and if anyone investigated deeply enough, the name Elena Vasquez would come up first. Late afternoon, as the crowd outside began chanting for a stay, she got a call from the warden's office. "Vasquez, come to my office now." Mitchell's voice came through the phone, short and cold. Elena entered, seeing him standing before the TV screen showing hundreds protesting. He turned it off, faced her. "Do you know what's happening?" he asked, voice low but fiery. "I just saw the news," Elena replied, trying to keep steady. Mitchell placed a stack of papers on the desk, printed Chronicle article. "Do you recognize anything? These documents could only come from our internal system. I checked the access logs. Night of June 14th, someone entered the archives with your card." Elena felt her throat dry, but she looked him straight in the eye. "I just reviewed the file because of irregularities." "And you sent it to the press?" Mitchell pressed. Elena was silent. That silence was the answer. The warden sighed, tossed the printout on the desk. "You've just thrown this whole prison into the storm. Do you understand the consequences?" She replied slowly, almost whispering, "I understand, but at least someone out there heard the truth." Mitchell looked at her long. In his eyes was a mix of anger and understanding. Finally, he said softly, "Go back to your dorm. We'll contact you when there's an investigation order." "And Vasquez," he paused, "I don't know if you're right or wrong, but sometimes being right doesn't save anyone." Elena nodded, walked out, the door slamming behind her. Outside, the crowd shouts mixed with media helicopters circling the prison. She looked up at the Texas sky blazing red in sunset. In that light, she knew all secrets were exposed, and the fate of Ethan Morales, as well as her own, was now between two words: justice and punishment. The next morning, the Texas sky was covered in pale gray like a mourning veil over the town of Huntsville. Early cold wind blew through the prison walls, carrying dampness from last night's rain. Outside the gate, hundreds still gathered, holding signs and candles, singing prayers for Ethan Morales. It had been over a week since the news broke, and public opinion was now split in two, half demanding justice for the wrongfully convicted, the other half believing the killer must pay. Meanwhile, inside the thick walls of Huntsville unit, the clock ticked the final minutes. Execution time was set for 8 a.m. At 6:40, all procedures were ready. Ethan was led from isolation to the preparation area, wrists cuffed, eyes still strangely calm. Elena, though temporarily suspended, stayed under administrative support. In truth, she couldn't leave knowing he was about to die for a crime she believed he didn't commit. Warden Mitchell, face heavy, reviewed procedures for the staff. No one spoke a word. Everything proceeded like hundreds of executions before, just different this time. Everyone knew outside. Hundreds of thousands were watching live, waiting to see if the state would halt. At 7:30, the phone rang in the warden's office. A duty staff ran in, face pale. "Warden line from Austin. The Texas Supreme Court is in emergency session." The room went dead silent. Mitchell grabbed the receiver, listened for seconds, then replied shortly, "Understood." He hung up, eyes flickering. "No official decision yet," he said softly, "but they're considering a stay of execution order." Elena stood outside the door, heart pounding so hard she heard each beat in her chest. Minutes dragged slowly. 7:58. 2 minutes before injection procedure began. Ethan had been taken to the execution chamber, lying on the cold metal table. 2 staff checked restraints. A priest read a short prayer, voice trembling. Elena stood at the observation window, tears silently welling. She knew she had done everything possible, but now it all depended on one phone call. 7:59, the red phone in the warden's office rang. That sound cut through the tense space like a knife. Mitchell picked up, nodded, then turned toward the injection room. "Stay," he shouted loud, voice echoing the corridor. "Halt procedure immediately. Emergency order from state court. Stay of execution for case review." In an instant, everyone froze. One staff removed the IV needle, another helped Ethan sit up. He lifted his head, as if not believing what he heard. "I'm still alive?" he asked softly, voice hoarse. No one answered, but Elena had stepped in, unable to hold back tears. She approached, grasped his hand, thin, cold, but warmer than anything she'd felt in these deathly walls. Ethan looked at her, eyes wet. "You did it," he said in broken breaths. "No, the truth saved you," she replied, voice trembling but firm. And then, for the first time in 8 years, Ethan Morales broke down crying. His sobs were soft, but resounding in the room, used only to silence in machines. A few staff bowed heads, no one daring to look straight. Warden Mitchell stood outside, arms crossed, eyes weary, but with a hint of relief. He knew, deep down, this was the first time he had seen justice arrive before death could put the final period. Elena said no more. She just gripped Ethan's hand, as if letting go would let the truth be swallowed by darkness again. Morning light shone through the small window, falling on their faces, a faint but strangely warm glow. Outside, church bells rang from afar, mixing with the crowd's cheers at the gate. News spread almost instantly. Texas State Court officially stays execution of death row inmate Ethan Morales, after new evidence. Media outlets reported simultaneously, reporters jostling to film, and on social media, millions shared the photo of Huntsville prison gates that windy morning, the moment the whole state seemed to hold its breath. Inside the isolation cell, Elena sat by the bed, watching Ethan bury his head in trembling hands. Everything temporarily quieted, only the light wind whistling through the door crack. And in that moment, the narrator's voice rose, soft but deep, like a brief conclusion to the storm just past. Sometimes, justice comes late, but there are times it arrives in the final moment, when faith is exhausted, and man thinks there's nothing left to lose. Sometimes, justice just needs to arrive, in the final breath. After that fateful morning, Texas was no longer peaceful as before. News of the state court, staying Ethan Morales' execution, quickly became national headlines. TV stations replayed the clip hourly, and newspapers called it the Huntsville miracle. But for those involved, they knew it wasn't a miracle. That was the truth finally rising. After 8 years buried, just days later, an expanded investigation order was issued. The Texas Attorney General's office sent a task force coordinating with the FBI to review the entire Morales case file. What they uncovered shook the entire justice system. Dozens of hidden documents, altered testimonies, and key evidence, the fingerprints of Raymond Cole, removed from the original file on orders from a group of lawyers representing the victim's company. From Houston to Dallas, arrest warrants flew. 3 executives of the corporation where the crime occurred were arrested for corruption, obstructing investigation, and fabricating evidence. A senior Dallas PD investigator was also questioned for colluding with business interests to protect them. As news spread, the public was stunned. Those who once believed Ethan Morales was the killer now asked how many other innocents were convicted just because the system wanted to close a case fast. Meanwhile, Lucia Reyes didn't rest a minute. She worked day and night with the legal team to fully exonerate Ethan. Every morning, she was in court, carrying the documents and Harold Green's recording, the ailing accountant who died just days after his testimony was released. His account, along with the internal recording Lucia obtained, became the decisive blow for case review. After 3 weeks of investigation, the Texas State Court officially declared insufficient evidence to convict Ethan Morales. Death sentence vacated. Defendant released immediately. When the verdict was read, Elena sat in her small room in the prison dorm, hands clenched tight, tears streaming. She had heard hundreds of verdicts pronounced, but never felt emotions surge like this. She didn't need recognition, just to know that man, who trusted her in desperation, was now free. Lucia became the public's hero. Her name appeared on every front page, TV channels praising her as the brave reporter who saved a life. In a press conference, when asked about the insider source who helped her get the evidence, Lucia just smiled. Sometimes justice needs someone inside daring to tell the truth. I can't name her, but if she's listening, I want to say the world owes her a thank you. Elena watched that interview on the old TV in the communal dining room. A few colleagues glanced at her secretly. Some nodded slightly in admiration, but others bowed their heads, avoiding her eyes. She knew in this place, people respected discipline more than righteousness. And what she did, though it brought justice, was still breaking the law. A few days later, the official suspension order arrived. The paper stated briefly, Elena Vasquez, temporarily suspended indefinitely for violating confidentiality regulations and disclosing internal documents. Below the line was Warden Mitchell's signature. When she finished reading, she wasn't surprised. She folded the paper, placed it on the table, and sighed. Mitchell called her to his office. He looked at her long before speaking. You know I don't agree with how you did it, but I can't deny the result. He stood up, looked out the window, where afternoon sunlight cast through the bars. I've been in this field 30 years. Sometimes, I wonder if we're protecting justice, or just protecting those in power. Elena said nothing. Mitchell turned back, voice softer. You won't be coming back to work here, at least not anytime soon. But, you saved a life, and perhaps, you saved the last bit of humanity in these walls. He extended his hand. Elena looked at that hand for a few seconds, then took it, squeezing lightly. No more words needed. As she left the office, she walked slowly down the familiar corridor, where end-of-day light cast long through the bars. Each step echoed like a heartbeat, both sad and relieved. She had lost the job she had been attached to for nearly 10 years, but in return, she regained something more precious, faith in people and in herself. That evening, as wind from the south blew over the low hills, Elena stood on the dorm porch, looking at the changing sky. On the radio news, the announcer read slowly, Ethan Morales, the man once sentenced to death, was fully released today. He said in the interview, I'm grateful to those who didn't stay silent. Sometimes, justice doesn't come from the courts, but from hearts that still believe in the truth. Elena closed her eyes, smiling faintly. Wind tousled her hair, carrying the smell of damp earth after rain. Her life from here would take a different path, but in that moment, she knew she had done the right thing, even if it cost her everything she once had. 3 months later, Texas autumn arrived, with gentle sunlight and the faint smell of damp earth in the air. The massive iron gate of Huntsville unit opened, and Ethan Morales stepped out, the man who had lived 8 years between cold walls, now breathing his first breath of freedom. No flashy welcome convoy, No loud cheers, just a few reporters standing across the street, filming the exonerated death row inmate leaving the facility. He wore a simple white shirt, carrying a small personal effects bag issued by the prison to those released. His hair had grayed considerably, skin tanned, but his walk was still straight and slow. In the distance, among the small silent crowd, Elena Vasquez stood leaning against a lamppost, not in uniform, not wanting anyone to recognize her. She had quit. No longer part of this system, but in her heart, she hadn't left those walls. When Ethan stepped out, their eyes met briefly, but enough to know they had gone through the same journey, though on different sides of the bars. No words were spoken right away. Ethan approached, each step heavy. When just a few steps away, he stopped, looking down at his worn shoes. "I didn't think you'd come," he said, voice hoarse, eyes unable to hide emotion. Elena smiled faintly, voice soft as wind. "I wasn't sure either, but maybe I needed to see this to believe it wasn't all in vain." Ethan nodded. Wind blew lightly through the trees on both sides of the road, yellow leaves falling scattered on the ground. They stood silent for a few seconds, amid distant camera sounds and early morning birds. Then he spoke, voice trembling with emotion. "No one believed me. Not the police, not the courts, not even the lawyer. But you believed. You didn't know me, owed me nothing, yet you believed." Elena looked at him, eyes softening. "I don't know why I believed, Ethan. Maybe because when I saw you, I saw the soldier I once couldn't save. Maybe because if I stayed silent, you'd die. And if that happened, the last bit of humanity in me would die too." Ethan pressed his lips, eyes welling. He started to say something, but then just took a deep breath, lifted his head, as if swallowing tears. "I don't know how to thank you," he said softly. "I thought I'd die in that cell. That truth could never beat power. You proved me wrong." Elena shook her head faintly. "No, Ethan, you proved it. I just brought your story to light. You were the one who held on to faith when there was nothing left to believe in." He fell silent, eyes looking far down the road leading out of town, the road he had only imagined in his mind for 8 years. A small Houston Chronicle van parked nearby. Lucia stepped out, waving to him from afar. Ethan smiled, waved back, then turned to Elena. "Lucia says she'll help me start over. Job, place to live. I don't know if I can live like a normal person anymore." "You'll learn again," Elena said gently. "Freedom is another kind of prison, but at least this time you get to choose how to escape." Ethan looked at her long eyes, saying more than brief words. She realized he had changed, not the desperate man she met in the dark cell anymore, but a man who had died inside and just been reborn. "What will you do now?" he asked. Elena shrugged faintly. "I don't know, maybe leave Huntsville, find a quieter place. I've spent too many years believing in walls. Now maybe I need to learn to believe in people." He nodded, a faint smile crossing his lips. They stood silent, looking at each other amid wind and pale sunlight. Then Ethan extended his hand, the hand once cuffed now trembling but firm. Elena took it, squeezing lightly. That hand carried both gratitude and deep sorrow, the sorrow of two people who once lost faith in the world, but found hope in each other. "Hold on to that faith," she said softly. "Don't let them take it again." He nodded, then let go. A black car pulled up, door opened. Lucia signaled him. Ethan turned back to look at Elena one last time. "Goodbye, Vasquez. Goodbye, Morales," she replied, voice choking. He got in the car, door closed, and the vehicle rolled slowly away from the prison gate. Elena watched until it disappeared around the bend. The sun rose higher, light shining on the concrete walls, making them less cold. She stood still a long time, then turned away, walking, heart heavy yet strangely relieved. Both carried their own wounds, he the scars of loss, she the wound of betrayed faith in the system she once protected. But at the same time, they carried peace, something only gained when people dare face the truth, no matter the cost. And as wind blew through the trees at the gate, Elena knew, whatever path her life took from now, at least one thing she would never regret: believing in the truth, even when no one else did. Time passed. Nearly a year after Ethan Morales was released, his name no longer just tied to the shocking Texas wrongful conviction case, but to a new movement called the Foundation for Justice. Together with reporter Lucia Reyes, who brought his story to light, Ethan founded the organization to help wrongfully convicted people find their voice again. The first office was just a small room in an old building downtown Houston, with a few old wooden desks, 2 computers, and a simple sign etched with "Truth doesn't die in silence." Every day, dozens of letters from prisons across Texas arrived. The writers were all inmates, some claiming innocence, others just asking someone to review their files once more. Ethan read every letter, noted carefully, then called Lucia to verify. He told her, "If anyone understands what they're going through, it's me." Lucia smiled faintly, replied, "And if anyone has the guts to listen, it's me." They became an odd pair, a former death row inmate and a reporter, building what they called a conscience network. News of the organization spread quickly, at first just small local articles, then long national TV features. People donated, volunteer lawyers joined, law students came for internships. In months, the Foundation for Justice grew from an idea into a real movement. And amid it all, Elena Vasquez, the woman who traded her career for faith and truth, stood silently behind, unknown to anyone. She didn't want public attention, no titles or praise. But every few weeks, Lucia received an unmarked envelope at the office. Inside, lists of inmates, neat handwritten notes, sometimes photocopies of internal files. No need to ask, Lucia knew who sent it. That information was often uncannily accurate: file numbers, denied appeal dates, old investigator names. Lucia called Elena by a code in internal files, the silent one. Thanks to that data, in 6 months, they reopened 5 cases, 2 declared innocent after finding new DNA evidence. One of the released, in his first interview, said, "I was saved by someone who once lived in prison. I haven't met her, but I'll be grateful to her forever." When Elena read that line in the paper, she just smiled, folded it, and put it in the drawer. She didn't need to be known. All she needed was the feeling that though she left the field, she could still do right. One October afternoon, Lucia and Ethan held a small panel at the University of Texas in Austin. Hundreds of students, reporters, and retired judges attended. Ethan, in a simple suit, stood on stage recounting his story. His voice was low, but carried the weight of someone who walked through death. "I once thought this system was the enemy," he said, "but now I understand. The system has no soul, only the people in it do. And if brave enough, we can make it change." Lucia sat in the front row, looking at him, eyes full of pride. After the talk, when asked if she regretted risking her career to bring the case public, Lucia just laughed. "If I had to choose again, I'd still do it. But to be fair, the bravest person in this story isn't me, but the woman who broke the silence to tell the truth." The audience applauded, unaware that woman sat quietly at the back of the hall, in a gray coat, unrecognized. Elena had come, unannounced. She listened, eyes welling, seeing Ethan stand there, steady, full of faith, not the death row inmate she once saw through bars anymore, but a man who found reason to live again. As people left, she slipped out the door, but Ethan spotted her in the crowd. He stopped, smiled, didn't call, just nodded faintly, that nod saying everything. Then she left, stepping into the gentle Texas night, heart light as wind. Their story, from then on, was cited by universities, magazines, and human rights organizations as a prime example of courage in a seemingly unshakable system. People called it the Huntsville miracle, but those involved knew it wasn't a miracle. It was the result of people choosing to speak truth, even at the cost of honor, freedom, or their whole lives. In the small office of the Foundation for Justice, the photo on the wall showed Ethan, Lucia, and a paper with Elena's scrawled words in blue ink. "Justice isn't something the system creates. It's what people must keep alive, even in the dark." Under Houston's faint afternoon light, those words reflected dimly on the glass frame, simple, humble, but carrying the weight of an entire journey. Time passed. The first winter since the Foundation for Justice was founded blanketed Texas in thin fog, and Elena Vasquez's life was now more peaceful than ever. She lived in a small apartment on the outskirts of Austin, beige-painted walls, window overlooking St. Mary's Church, with its tall steeple and year-round rose garden. Every morning, she helped the church prepare free breakfast for the homeless, afternoons assisting in the community kitchen. No uniform, no orders, just hands once firm now learning gentle work again. To those around her, Elena was just Sister Elena, the quiet woman who always helps. No one knew she was once a corrections officer at Huntsville Prison, who traded her entire career for a death row inmate. Sometimes, washing hands in warm water, she remembered the resounding clang of iron doors, the cold light of the execution chamber, and felt her heart tighten. But that memory was no longer a wound, but a reminder that she once dared choose right, even when everything was against her. One morning, while sweeping the church lobby, Father Brooks, the former Huntsville chaplain, now retired, visited. He placed a thin envelope in her hand. "I think this is for you," he said, kindly smile under his silver mustache. On the envelope was the familiar handwriting, Ethan Morales. Elena sat on a wooden bench, hands trembling slightly as she opened it. Inside, just a few lines, but each word touched her soul. "Elena, today we won our 10th case with the Foundation. Another man is free. I want you to know that every time someone walks out of prison, I think of the moment you held my hand in the execution chamber that year. You saved me, not just from death, but from losing faith in people. You said justice would win, and you were right. I brought justice back where it belongs." Elena folded the letter, tears falling on the paper. She smiled, a faint, deep but bright smile, as if finally hearing the response she had silently awaited for years. That afternoon, she stopped by the small grocery store, where stacks of daily newspapers were displayed. On the Houston Chronicle front page, a bold headline ran, "The Foundation for Justice exonerates 3 more. Humanitarian model spreads across America." Photo of Ethan shaking hands with lawyers, Lucia beside him, beaming. Elena paused, read every line carefully, then whispered on her breath, "It was never just justice, it was mercy." She bought the paper, took it home, pressed it in her old Bible, where she marked passages on forgiveness and redemption. As evening fell, golden late sunlight shone through the window, reflecting on the wall. Elena sat by the window, sipping tea, hearing church bells ring far away. In that lingering sound, she thought of Ethan, the man once an inmate, now standing for justice, and realized both had been reborn in their own ways. He reclaimed his life, she her soul. Occasionally, Lucia still sent her photos, workshops, faces of released inmates, group shots outside the organization's new headquarters. Elena never replied, just smiled opening the envelope, as if knowing they continued was enough. She needed no spotlight, no honor. In silence, she knew this life finally had meaning. One late evening after locking the church, Elena sat alone in the nave. The dim room lit only by altar candles, reflecting on her face. She thought of all that had passed. War, prison, fear, and forgiveness. Images rose and faded like incense smoke. She bowed her head faintly, whispering the shortest but deepest prayer of her life. "Let me never stay silent before wrong, and give me courage to choose mercy over fear." Outside, night wind blew, carrying the distant rhythm of clock chimes. Austin City sank into quiet, only golden light from the church steeple casting on the sky. In that moment, the narrator's voice rose, soft but firm, like a conclusion not just for her story, but for all who ever believed an ordinary person couldn't change anything. In a Texas prison built on concrete and rules, one woman proved that conscience can still open the heaviest doors. And as the candle flickered, shining on Elena Vasquez's serene face, the world seemed to pause a beat, making way for the powerful silence of a woman who dared follow her conscience's voice, even when all around was only cold walls. If you believe stories of courage and justice deserve to be shared, hit subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next moving journeys. Thank you for watching. See you in the next story, where truth and mercy still shine.